3 years had passed since their little girl was snatched away, and Jason had finally stopped the relentless search. He believed that fate decided everything, whether life or death, and he didn't want to be selfish. The key, he thought, was to live well in the now. But fate had other plans. His wife, the woman he adored, disappeared too. Overnight, Jason aged like he'd seen a century, dedicating the next 50 years solely to finding her. In this fresh start, he chose to prioritize safeguarding his daughter and asked for a separation. To his surprise, Jason experienced a rebirth. On his very first night back, he snagged a flight and whisked his wife away overseas for a getaway. It took 6 months before the memory of their daughter resurfaced. Clutching a stuffed toy he grabbed at the airport, Jason headed to retrieve her from school. But without a second thought, she shoved him aside and ran into another guy's arms, apologizing, "Sorry, I've got a new dad now." When news broke about Emily's disappearance, he and his partner had just had a massive argument. He grabbed her shoulders, nearly shouting, "Ella's been missing for 3 years. We've tried everything, but she's nowhere to be found." Life moves forward. Can't you look ahead? She reached out and slapped him hard, feeling completely shattered. But they were Emily's parents. If they didn't keep searching, she might never return. Emily was their child. At 5, the nanny took her out for some sun in the neighborhood. In a split second, when the nanny turned around, the girl was gone. The nanny, terrified, didn't report it right away, missing the crucial window to save Emily. Jason and his wife tried countless ways to find her, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. This year marked 3 years since she disappeared. Suddenly, Jason declared he didn't want to keep searching and hoped she would let go too, urging her to live in the present. He suggested Emily might have a new life. His cold demeanor and resolve made her feel distant and heartbroken. Emily was a part of her. Losing a piece of herself was too excruciating to abandon. This led to their fiercest argument since getting married. In the past, she always leaned towards him a bit more and was willing to make compromises. Jason exploited her affection to make her back down, but when it came to Emily, she couldn't budge. Everything in the house was trashed. Her frantic screams nearly drained her energy. He just stood there, watching like she was some kind of clown. "Lisa, you're being too selfish. Do you have to mess up our home over a kid we can't get back?" Initially feeling guilty, he grew impatient. After that comment, he turned and locked himself in his room. The noisy living room suddenly went quiet. She sat on the couch, scrolling through photos of her daughter on her phone, tears streaming down her face. But the next moment, someone in the high school class group sent a message saying Emily was missing. That sharp and pretty girl had just moved to their class, catching the eye of many guys, including Jason. She saw the message and didn't think much of it until the previously shut door swung open abruptly. Jason looked flustered, repeatedly dialing his phone, but it wouldn't connect. He whispered, "Emily, please don't let anything bad happen." He kept repeating, "Emily, please don't let anything bad happen." Normally calm, even when Ella went missing, he stayed composed, never looking so frantic, trembling with anxiety. For Jason, Emily was like a beacon in his heart. She had never held any special place before. Jason was the guy she'd liked since she was a kid. Their families were a perfect match, and they were childhood sweethearts. She had feelings for him since she was young, but he was always distant. During high school, his different treatment of Emily made her lose hope. Later, Emily chose to study abroad and willingly let go of him, cutting off their budding romance. Jason fell into a slump for a long time before slowly emerging from the darkness, never mentioning Emily again. She stayed by his side year after year. Eventually, she waited for him to confess his feelings. They became a couple, then got married and had their sweet Emily. She truly treasured this relationship, but looking back now, it felt like a joke. She thought Jason was just reacting to his high school crush, which is why he was so shaky when Emily went missing. But she didn't expect that once it was confirmed Emily was truly gone, he became so overwhelmed with grief that he aged overnight. Yet, when Ella vanished, he stayed composed without a hint of instability. Turns out, having a child with someone you don't love can lead to not loving that child. In the end, Jason decided to help Emily's family search for her. She asked, "What about our daughter, the one who's been taken for 3 whole years? What are we going to do?" Jason's gaze shifted. "We've been looking for Ella for 3 years, which should be enough." But Emily's different. She just disappeared. Maybe if we try harder, we can find her. This effort could last forever. I spent my whole life searching for Ella, and he spent his searching for Emily. This caused endless fights between us. I urged him to give up. After all, Emily has her own family and friends, and Ella needs us even more. But Jason dismissed her. Lisa, you're being too selfish. Emily's still alive. How can we just give up on her? Disappointment, heartbreak, and anger made her lose all hope in him. In their twilight years, they still hadn't found Ella or Emily. They could only lie on their sickbeds. She looked at her daughter's photo on her phone while he stared at Emily's, filled with deep sorrow and extreme irony. If I could start over, I'd wish Ella didn't have you as her father, because he really didn't deserve it. But unexpectedly, she had a rebirth. It brought her back to the day her daughter was taken by human traffickers. She burst through the door, nearly sprinting all the way, desperate to save her Emily before those damn traffickers arrived. Luckily, just before they could reach Ella, she grabbed her and yelled for the negligent nanny to call the cops immediately. The presence of traffickers in their community was a big deal. Many residents, fearing the traffickers might have allies who could endanger their kids, gathered around, waiting for the police to ensure the traffickers faced justice. She didn't leave either, but while waiting, she saw Jason rushing out. At that moment, he should have just come back from a business trip, tired and probably crashing in the bedroom until evening. Only when the nanny couldn't find Ella and had to inform her about the disappearance did Jason wake up abruptly. But now, something felt off. Could Jason also have been reborn? If so, he should know the top priority was to save poor Ella, not panicking around. But she didn't have time to ponder. With the police arriving, she had to hold Ella and give her statement first. By the time she finished and returned home, it was already dark. "Where's Dad?" Ella held her hand and dashed into the bedroom as soon as they stepped inside. She adored Jason, often hugging his legs and calling him Daddy, sweetly. But the bedroom was empty. Jason still hadn't come home. Ella looked a bit disappointed but was always obedient, trying hard to smile. Not seeing her dad, she thought it was the same as before, believing he was just working too much. "I haven't finished my book yet. Dad'll freak out if he knows Ella isn't reading." She cheerfully ran to the living room, found a spot, and began to read her storybook seriously. Regrets from her past life made her unable to leave Ella's side even for a moment. She sat in the living room holding Ella. Ella turned to smile and kissed her cheek, saying, "Mommy, don't be sad. Daddy will be home from work soon. Ella and Mommy will wait together." Maybe it was the memories from her past life. This man she once loved deeply, whom she had despised for half her life, in this new life, even if everything went back to normal, she no longer wanted to compromise for herself or her daughter. Divorce was inevitable. However, Jason's phone was completely unreachable, always off, as if he had vanished. She couldn't reach him for an entire day and night. Did bad people take Daddy away? Although Ella was young, she was more mature than her peers and could keenly sense her mother's emotions. She tugged at her skirt with her tiny hand, eyes filled with sadness. She quickly bent down and hugged her, softly reassuring her. No, Daddy might just be caught up with something important. But the day after tomorrow was Ella's birthday. He would definitely be back. Really? Ella looked at her with her round, glistening eyes, full of hope. But the truth was, he had gone to find Emily. That evening, she held Ella while reading her bedtime story. Ella fell asleep in her arms, and she checked social media, where she immediately saw Emily's latest post. There was a picture and a line of text. The picture showed a pair of hands around her waist, looking incredibly close. The text read, "After all this time, I finally waited for your confession." There was a scar on the index finger of that right hand, amusingly similar to Jason's. In the comments, everyone was congratulating Emily and the unseen guy, wishing them happiness. She glanced at the IP address at the bottom of the post. It was from an island abroad, a spot known as a romantic getaway for couples. When she and Jason had just started dating, he'd said he wanted to take her there to showcase their love, but he was too busy with work, and they had to wait. That wait stretched until they married and had a child. Year after year passed, but it all felt empty. Now Jason had abandoned everything just to rekindle his lost feelings and was enjoying a vacation with his white moonlight. She looked down at that photo and felt nothing stirring in her heart. Maybe she was too disappointed in her past life. She had felt pain, cried, and caused a scene. After the hysteria, when she locked eyes with him, all that remained was disappointment and resentment. She opened the picture, zoomed in, and saved it. Since she had already decided to divorce, she would definitely fight for Ella's custody. She would also keep backup copies of all evidence proving his infidelity, so that during the divorce, she could secure the best interest for herself. She consulted a lawyer to draft the divorce papers. But with Jason now abroad, deliberately cutting off all contact, she couldn't immediately deliver the papers to him. She could only wait and then inform her parents about the situation. But as she expected, when she finally mentioned wanting to divorce Jason, her parents were strongly against it. She didn't hide anything and directly told them about Jason's infidelity. Her mother stared at the photo silently for a long time. Finally, she looked up, her eyes showing something hard to read. Lisa, sometimes it's better to ignore certain things, and life goes on. Besides, you have a daughter now. For her sake, don't be too selfish, okay? Her own mother was asking her to overlook her husband's mistakes for their child's sake. Although she had long understood that her parents were also cold-hearted, prioritizing work and family interests, she never expected that even now her happiness would be outweighed by the ridiculous benefits of staying together. No, Mom. If I choose to just get by, that would be true selfishness and irresponsibility. My life isn't just Ella's. I can take good care of her by myself. At least, whether Jason is around or not, those past few years wouldn't have made much of a difference. Her Mia, she indeed felt guilty for not being able to provide her with a complete family, but the one responsible for all this wasn't her. So why should she bear the consequences of what Jason had sown all by herself? Her dad hit her hard, saying that even if she divorced, he'd never let her come back home. With a divorce, she would completely become Lisa, the one without a home. Unable to hold back, she shed a few tears. It's fine. Let's just say our father-daughter bond has ended. Anyway, divorce was inevitable. She left with Ella and didn't head straight home. Halfway through the drive, she couldn't hold back her emotions and found a secluded spot to pull over and cried helplessly in front of her daughter. Ella was very well behaved. She unbuckled her car seat, climbed into the passenger seat, and without saying a word, gently patted her mother's back with her little hand. When she looked up, Ella handed her 2 tissues to wipe her tears. Mommy, don't be sad. Ella is here. Ella will always be here. Her voice still had that sweet, childish tone. She looked at her and asked, if Daddy and Mommy were to split and you had to follow Mommy, would you be okay with that? Ella didn't answer right away. She tilted her head as if deep in thought. After a long while, she asked back, if we leave Daddy, will Mommy be happy? Will there be no more tears? She didn't know how to answer her. With a slight sob, she just murmured. Ella instantly smiled, stretched out her short arms, and hugged her like she used to. Ella wants Mommy to be happy, doesn't want Mommy to cry. Daddy is bad, I don't want him either. Unable to hold it in any longer, she directly hugged Ella and cried. The little girl, who had initially been giggling, suddenly pouted, feeling deeply wronged, and buried her face in her mother's chest, crying. As she cried intensely, her emotions overwhelmed her, and she suddenly felt a sharp pain in her chest. Ella knew her mother had a heart condition. Immediately, she wiped her tears and searched for her medicine in the car. But the pain in her chest was too intense, causing her vision to blur, and she began to faint. Just before she completely lost consciousness, she vaguely saw Ella frantically picking up her phone and imitating her as she tried to call Jason. But the call went unanswered. When she woke up, she found herself lying in a hospital bed. She was dazed for a few seconds. She quickly climbed out of bed and looked around, asking, "Where's Ella?" Suddenly worried that something had happened to her daughter because she couldn't bear the pain of losing her again. Maybe Ella heard her voice. Ella, sitting on the sofa, put down the picture book in her hands and ran to her bedside. She immediately hugged her, and Ella sat beside her, tears still glistening in her eyes. "Mommy, you finally woke up?" Her voice still carried a sob, but she smiled as she leaned against her, quietly watching without saying anything. She asked her, "Ella, who brought Mommy to the hospital?" Ella counted on her fingers, as if recalling, It was a really handsome uncle. Just as she finished speaking, someone pushed the door to the ward open. That person said, "You're awake?" She turned to look at the door, and upon seeing who it was, she couldn't help but widen her eyes and exclaimed, "Mark." Mark was also her high school classmate, but he was completely different from Jason. Jason was distant, like a flower on a high peak, sacred and untouchable. But Mark was sunny, always enthusiastic about people and things, wearing a smile that warmed everyone around him. Not only that, but Mark and she also grew up together. Mark's grandfather liked her a lot when they were young, and their families joked about an arranged marriage. But later, she met Jason and focused all her attention on him. Eventually, when she confirmed her relationship with Jason, Mark happened to receive an acceptance letter from a prestigious university abroad and chose to study overseas. In her past life, Mark didn't choose to come back. Or maybe he did. But at that time, all she could think about was her missing daughter, so she didn't pay much attention. Seeing him suddenly now gave her a feeling as if they were worlds apart. "You have a heart condition. The doctor has warned you since childhood not to have too many emotional ups and downs. Luckily, I happened to drive by this time." Mark peeled an apple for her, carefully cut it into small pieces, placed them on a plate, and after putting a toothpick in one piece, he handed it to her and gave another to Ella. Ella thanked him and smiled innocently. "Uncle Mark, how did you know Mommy always wants her apples cut into small pieces?" Mark playfully poked her nose, his gaze toward her full of warmth and a hint of teasing. From childhood to now, she's always been the most spoiled. "If it's not cut well, will she eat it?" Ella shook her head. "But at home, Daddy never cuts fruits for Mommy. Mommy always prepares them and brings them to Daddy." At this, Mark stopped laughing. He quietly stared at her, not saying a word, just holding her gaze for a long time. "Why are you staring at me like that, Mark?" His intense gaze made her feel a bit uneasy. She pretended to lower her head to eat the fruit, and Mark suddenly reached out and tapped her forehead, which hurt a bit. "Mark, that really hurts. I'm still a patient." She couldn't help but shout. They were childhood friends, as familiar as could be. Apart from the initial awkwardness and surprise, they had returned to the same level of familiarity as before. In front of Mark, she was always unreasonable and would purposely tease him, and he would let her do it. Just like now. After she shouted at him, he pretended not to hear and handed her another piece of apple. "Don't get worked up. Eat some more fruit." She directly took the plate over and stuffed 2 pieces into her mouth, still unable to hold back her mumbling. "It's been years since we last met, and you hit me right away without any explanation." Mark shrugged with a smile. "I can't help it. I've liked teasing you since we were kids." After saying that, he turned to leave, saying he was going to find her attending physician. She was focused on eating the fruit, so she didn't hear him say as he left, "I can't stand to see you suffer. I wish I could knock some sense into that love-struck brain of yours." Her health wasn't too problematic. After waking up, the attending physician came to check on her again and then let her go home to rest. Since she had made up her mind to get a divorce, she didn't want to continue living in the marital home, which was under Jason's name, and planned to move out with Ella. She also had several properties under her name. She let Ella choose her favorite one and was ready to move in there. Mark knew she was getting a divorce and that she planned to move right away. Without saying a word, he came over to help and moved all of their things within a day. The new home was just a street away from where Mark lived now. Ella was thrilled when she found out. "Do you really like Uncle Mark?" That night, as she held Ella in her arms, Ella nestled close to her, chattering about Mark. For the past few days, Mark had been acting like he didn't have a job, coming over to eat every day. As soon as Ella got home from school, she would hang out with him, and they seemed to get along very well. On the weekends, they even made plans to go out together, completely ignoring her. She felt like an outsider. Ella sensed her sadness and hurriedly hugged her neck, nibbling on her. "Uncle Mark is awesome. He's willing to play with me and is so patient. Unlike Daddy, who always says he's busy and is forever busy. He didn't even come to my birthday yesterday." It was Uncle Mark who stayed with her and gave her the birthday gift she wanted the most. "If Uncle Mark were my daddy, that would be great." By the end of her statement, there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. Children have a simple world. She may not be very clever, but she can keenly perceive Jason's detachment. In contrast, Mark provided her with a fatherly love she had never experienced before. Her heart ached for her daughter even more, and she held her tightly in her arms. Jason truly didn't deserve to be a father. That afternoon, when Ella came home from school, she seemed a bit upset. She asked her, but Ella didn't really respond. It wasn't until dinner that she finally spoke up, looking wronged. The kindergarten is hosting a parent-child activity, and several activities require Dad to participate. But Daddy? She sighed and replied, "It's okay, Mommy can do it too." Ella shook her head, still not looking happy. She stared down at the rice in her bowl, lost in thought. When the doorbell suddenly rang, she didn't need to guess. She knew it was someone coming over to mooch a meal. Her previously dejected daughter suddenly perked up. "Uncle Mark is here!" She immediately hopped down from her chair to open the door for Mark. "Ella, you're even cuter today." Mark picked up Ella and walked to the dining table, the two of them appearing as familiar as a real father and daughter. She felt a pang of jealousy and looked at Mark with a hint of bitterness. "She's our precious daughter, and she's closer to you than to me. It's like I gave her to you." Mark's smile grew even brighter, and he playfully replied, "That's not a problem. Let's say she's mine. I promise to take good care of this precious daughter." She quickly snatched the child away from him. "No way. She's my precious daughter." Ella squeezed her hand, looking like a little adult. "You guys don't argue anymore. One is a dad and one is a mom. Ella likes both of you." Right, just a few days ago, I had already acknowledged him as a godfather. The two of them began to call each other godfather and precious daughter. Ella looked at Mark and blinked, suddenly saying, "Mommy, since he's a dad anyway, can Uncle Mark be my dad and come with me to the parent-child activity?" She looked at Mark. He was also looking at her, as if asking for her opinion. After hesitating for a moment, she shook her head in refusal. "That shouldn't be too bad, but other classmates' dads will all come. Only my dad hasn't called me in a long time. Why can't Uncle Mark be my dad?" "Mommy, I don't want to be laughed at by other classmates as the kid that Daddy doesn't like." The more her daughter spoke, the more wrong she felt, and she even started to cry, making her heart ache. Mark quickly chimed in, "Ella is now my goddaughter. Jason is enjoying himself abroad. Isn't it better for me to participate? Do you want Ella to be laughed at by other kids?" Of course, I didn't want that. So, for the parent-child activity on Monday, Mark took on the role of dad and went to the kindergarten with her. The games were all quite simple. There were tests of cooperation between fathers and daughters, as well as tests of understanding between parents. For example, what is Mommy's favorite color? Mark, purple. What is Mommy's favorite fruit? Mark, apple. What does Mommy hate the most? Mark hates being deceived by others. Mark answered all the questions correctly in the shortest amount of time, and she couldn't help but give him a thumbs up. The host was a kindergarten teacher who held a script, smiling at the children to create a lively atmosphere. She then asked the last question about moms. "So who is Daddy's favorite person?" Many parents answered with their children's names. She also wrote down Ella's name, as this type of question could only be answered with the child's name. But Mark's answer was, "You." "Me?" She was momentarily taken aback and couldn't help but point to herself. The host smiled and said, "It seems that Ella's parents have a very good relationship. They're the only ones among all the dads here who answered differently." For some reason, her heart started to race. Even until this segment ended, her heartbeat hadn't returned to normal. Mark took Ella's hand and walked over to her. "What's wrong? Is your heart uncomfortable again?" His voice was always gentle, and his eyes showed genuine concern and worry. She shook her head. "Mark, why didn't you write down Ella's name for the answer?" Mark's smile faltered for a moment. Then he replied, "As Ella's dad, of course. I love Ella's mom the most. So?" "I don't see anything wrong with saying I like you. There is something wrong, a lot wrong." Her heart raced even faster. In the following 2 months, she suspected that Mark completely treated her home as his own. Although their families were close when they were kids, and she did spend a lot of time with him, they were now grown up. She was even married with a child, so she should avoid any appearance of impropriety. But Mark was unfazed and seriously rebutted her. "Aren't you preparing to file for divorce?" Are you just playing hard to get and hoping to get back together? If you do that, I'll really look down on you. Lisa, if someone isn't right for you, you have to let them go. No, I just simply felt the need to avoid any potential misunderstandings. I never said I would hesitate. However, after he finished speaking, he inexplicably became angry, took Ella to her room, and completely ignored her. Until dinner, she reassured him multiple times that she would definitely not hesitate. Only then did he let out a sigh of relief. Fortunately, it's not beyond saving. Hearing his words, she forced a smile. Mark, do you think I don't care about my reputation? Ella sat between them, resting her chin on her little hands, beaming at them, her eyes full of happiness. If time could freeze at this moment, she would have the illusion that this was the happiness she once longed for. Unfortunately, she had to return to reality. In the third month, Jason and Emily's trip finally ended, and they chose to return to the country. Upon returning, Jason finally remembered his poor daughter from his previous life. So, as soon as he landed, he came to the kindergarten to pick Ella up from school. She bumped into him right at the kindergarten entrance. Jason was holding a doll, one that Ella hated the most. When he saw her, he looked somewhat guilty and unnatural. Lisa, I had some urgent business at the company and had to go abroad, so I forgot to tell you. She casually responded with an. Clearly, he was out of the country with his mistress, but he insisted it was for work. Not a single truthful word came out of his mouth, making her despise him even more. But it didn't matter. Once he signed the divorce papers, he could do whatever he wanted. Perhaps sensing her indifference, or maybe genuinely feeling guilty, he suddenly became anxious and tried to explain something to her. She didn't want to listen, interrupting him. It's almost time. Ella will be out soon. Only then did Jason shut his mouth, holding the ugly doll as he awaited his daughter's exit from school. At first, Ella was excited, but the moment she saw Jason, her smile immediately faded, and her eager little steps turned into a slow walk toward him. Ella, look what Daddy brought you. Ella, after all, was his biological daughter. Family and love are inherently different. He could treat her coldly, but he couldn't truly act without remorse in front of his daughter. Ella glanced at the ugly doll and immediately showed her disdain. In the past, even though Jason often gave her toys she didn't like, out of that pitiful fatherly love, Ella would always accept them begrudgingly and say she liked them. But during this time, she had been spending all day with Mark. Mark had never been one to put himself at a disadvantage. His likes and dislikes were always clear. He would never stoop to please others by compromising his own preferences. So if he didn't like something, he would say it loudly. Now, Ella wouldn't pretend to be delighted just to spare Jason's feelings. Instead, she acted as if she didn't see him and walked straight over to her mother. Mommy, are you the only one picking me up today? Her eyes held a hint of anticipation. Mark had promised her yesterday that he would come with her to pick her up after school. But in the afternoon, Mark's family suddenly called, sounding like something significant had happened. Mark hurried home, saying he would return as soon as possible, but didn't specify when. As she pondered how to explain this to Ella, Jason approached with the doll. Ella, why aren't you talking to Daddy? This doll was specially bought for you. Do you like it? When Jason handed her the doll, a small receipt accidentally fell out. She glanced down. The receipt showed it was purchased at the airport. Clearly, Jason only remembered he had a daughter after returning to the country. It was quite laughable. Ella was still young and didn't know many words, so she didn't understand what it meant to buy something at the airport. But she wasn't a fool. She could still tell the difference between being valued and being treated with indifference. Ella looked at Jason, pouting and hesitating to speak. She could see she was a little angry and wanted to refuse him, but she was concerned about Jason's feelings, so she was quite conflicted. She was about to speak up for her to refuse, but Ella suddenly seemed to see something, and her eyes brightened for a moment. Then she pushed away Jason, who was trying to hug her, and stepped back 2 paces. I haven't liked this kind of doll for a long time. Also, lying is not a good behavior. I saw on Mommy's phone that you went out to play and it wasn't for work at all. Lastly, I already have a new daddy. If you don't like Mommy and me, that's okay. I don't really need you. After saying that, Ella took her mother's hand and turned to run to the side. As she turned, she saw Mark standing by the car, waving to Ella. Daddy! Ella ran over, jumping straight into Mark's arms, wrapping her arms around his neck and planting a kiss on his cheek. Before even the sir, even though Mark was considered her godfather most of the time, Ella would just call him uncle. But today, if she weren't so young, she would genuinely suspect she was trying to provoke Jason. However, seeing Jason's face darken like a storm cloud, she had to admit it felt pretty good. Mark, who had a somewhat clumsy temperament, directly walked up to Jason, holding Ella, his gaze openly provocative. Your daughter hates that ugly doll, so don't give it to her again. It's embarrassing, Lisa. I think you need to explain yourself. Jason was at her new home, standing in the living room, holding a photo of Ella, Mark, and herself, looking utterly furious. The photo was taken last weekend during their picnic outing. Ella had wanted to go camping for a long time, but Jason always thought it was too childish and used work as an excuse to decline every time. Yet, during his trip abroad with Emily, he had taken a picture of them camping together. That day, she was lost in thought looking at the photo and didn't notice that her daughter had suddenly woken up. She saw it. Although she didn't say anything, her eyes turned red and her pillow got wet. So when Mark learned about this, he immediately canceled his work and took Ella out camping. They all had a great time that day, and Ella was constantly smiling, filled with a sense of satisfaction and joy that had been long absent. Gradually, she came back to her senses, looking at Jason, who truly couldn't stir up any waves anymore. Jason, this is pointless. In her previous life, she had been hysterical, and when she looked in the mirror at her crazed self, she found it rather unpleasant. So this time, she didn't want to make a fuss or argue with him. She didn't want to leave a crazy impression. She just wanted to part ways amicably. Jason's expression hardened as he grabbed the picture frame and smashed it on the floor. Lisa, it's only been 3 months, and you've been tangled with another man while taking our daughter with you. Do you think I'm dead? The glass frame shattered instantly, and their daughter, who was doing her homework in the room, got scared and started crying. She quickly went into the room, picked her up, gently soothing her and covering her ears, then turned to question Jason. What's the difference between you and being dead? She coldly stared at him, no longer feeling like parting amicably. She tore away the last shred of decency. Jason, do you really think I know nothing? Do you think I don't know where you've been for the past 3 months? You missed our daughter's birthday. You skipped the parent-child activity at kindergarten. And you were absent when I was hospitalized. When our daughter and I needed you, you were off traveling abroad with another woman, and then you come back with some random excuse, trying to fool me and Ella. Who is actually treating who like a fool here? Jason, what gives you the right to question me? At her words, Jason, who had been so confident, suddenly became a bit flustered. No, it's not like that. I really had things to do. Emily and I aren't in the kind of relationship you think. It's just that I don't know how to say it. I just wanted to fulfill her dream. He had cut off all contact and indeed hadn't shown any signs of wrongdoing. But Emily's social media was updated daily, ostentatiously flaunting their affection. Even if there were no photos of the two of them together, he would always deliberately capture those obvious features. Jason's necklace that he never took off, the red mole on Jason's neck, the long scar on Jason's abdomen. There were too many clues, enough that Ella only needed to glance at the photos to know that the man in them was her father. She felt quite ashamed. The moment she took the divorce papers out of the room, tears fell. But what did that matter? She would never jump into the same fire pit twice. So she directly slapped the papers onto his face, her tone resolute. Jason, let's get a divorce. At first, Jason shook his head and refused without hesitation. Lisa, what kind of joke is this? Our marriage isn't just about the two of us. It involves 2 family businesses and Ella. For the sake of our child, can't you be a little less selfish? This statement felt oddly familiar. She suddenly remembered in her past life when he made her give up searching for their daughter, which she refused, and he called her selfish. Also, when she didn't want him searching for Emily, he still accused her of being selfish. It was quite ridiculous. For my own sake and for my daughter's, I don't think maintaining a marriage with a man who is always on the verge of cheating is fair to anyone. At the very least, you're in the wrong, not me. It was Jason who had initiated the proposal while harboring feelings for someone else. It was Jason who, when their biological daughter went missing, was still thinking about his white moonlight. And it was Jason who, even with a second chance at life, still chose Emily first. She had already signed her name on the divorce papers. He was clearly the one at fault, and what she sought was reasonable compensation. She didn't think she was being greedy, especially since this was all for her daughter. Jason, if you had any backbone, you wouldn't cling to this. Divorce is better for both of us. Jason held the divorce papers, looking somewhat hurt, but she would rather it be that she misread him. He said, "Lisa, after so many years together, do you really think you can just say you want a divorce?" She echoed his words and asked back, "Jason, after so many years together, can you truly say your heart isn't occupied by another woman?" He fell silent. In the end, Jason signed his name. Those photos on social media were solid evidence, proof he couldn't find any excuses to refute. Cheating and betrayal had become established facts. Continuing to entangle themselves wouldn't be good for either of them. Jason was a businessman and surely understood this principle. After the divorce, she suddenly felt a sense of relief. As she left the Civil Affairs Bureau, she deliberately dressed up nicely, planning to celebrate a little. But just as she was about to turn around, Jason grabbed her wrist. "Lisa, no matter what, we've been married for 7 years. And Ella, she will always be my beloved daughter. No matter what happens in the future, you can always come to me. You, no need. She has me, and that's enough." Before Jason could finish his sentence, Mark appeared out of nowhere with Ella. He reached out and pulled her over. She lost her balance and fell straight into Mark's arms, while Ella covered her eyes with her little hands, purposely peeking through a small gap, her mouth stretching into a smile, looking very happy. As for Jason, his eyes held a complex and reluctant expression she couldn't decipher. "Mark, this is my family matter. You." "What's a family matter?" Mark interrupted Jason without hesitation, starting to confront him. "Is it about leaving your wife and daughter at home and then going abroad with another woman? Or being an invisible person when your wife and daughter need you? If this is a family matter, then sorry. As an outsider, I truly look down on your behavior." With that, Mark threw a punch directly at Jason's face. "Mark, are you crazy? Why are you hitting people?" She scolded him while applying medicine. When Mark threw that punch outside the Civil Affairs Bureau, Jason was momentarily stunned before swinging back in retaliation. Both of them had started boxing as kids, and every punch landed hard. She held her daughter in her arms and couldn't intervene at all. All she could do was watch as the two of them fought fiercely, exchanging blows until both were covered in blood, their clothes soaked red. When the staff from the Civil Affairs Bureau noticed, they hurried out to break it up, but ended up getting hurt themselves. In the end, both were taken to the police station. She had no choice but to hurry and bail Mark out. As for Jason, since they were already divorced, everything related to him no longer had anything to do with her. Naturally, she didn't need to get involved in the bail process. "I can't stand him bullying you," Mark said. Mark's face was bruised. He had a black eye from the punch, a heavy bruise on his mouth, and his cheek was scraped. Overall, he looked pretty battered, but Jason looked worse, covered in blood. Even if you couldn't stand it, there was no need to throw punches. "You still care about him?" Mark's eyes dimmed for a moment. She suddenly pressed down harder as she applied the medicine on him, making him yelp in pain. Only then did she speak. "I just think it's not worth dirtying your hands over a person like that." Mark returned to his previous smile and gently shook his head. "No, for you. I think it's worth it." With a thud, the cotton swab she was holding fell to the floor. Like before, her heart inexplicably began to race at his words, which sounded familiar. She couldn't tell if it was her imagination, so she didn't respond further. She just focused on tending to his face. The air suddenly fell silent. It was a bit eerie. In the end, it was Mark who couldn't hold back. He grabbed her hand, forcing her to look him in the eyes, his gaze filled with seriousness. He asked, "Lisa, you don't understand what I mean, right?" "Understand what?" "Maybe I understand a little bit, but Mark, I've been married and divorced, spending nearly 10 years proving that I was blind and loved the wrong person. I have a daughter. She's the most important person in my life, and I will absolutely never separate from her or let her suffer. So, do you understand what I mean? There aren't that many fair things in the world." A divorced woman with a child standing next to a successful, handsome man is always seen as mismatched by everyone, and she would never allow her daughter to be wronged. She thought her words would make Mark back off, but to her surprise, he became even more serious. So what if you've been married? It's Jason's fault for being blind and cheating on you. You've never wronged him. And Ella, she's adorable. She calls me daddy. She is your daughter and will also be my beloved daughter. No one can make her suffer in front of me. I promise. So, can you understand what I mean? Whether she understood or not, she wasn't sure. She only knew that in the end, she fled in a panic, and this matter came to an unresolved end. Mark's words were too sudden. She had no mental preparation and naturally couldn't respond immediately. He knew this too, so for the next week, he didn't come to find her. He gave her time to think. Meanwhile, after her divorce from Jason, he officially announced his relationship with Emily. The two openly flaunted their affection on social media, and the previously casual Emily now went all out, sending her various photos and warnings directly. Jason is now my boyfriend. Even though you have a daughter together, please know your place and don't act like a mistress. How ridiculous, she replied. So you know that being a mistress is shameless. She was so angered that she chose to block him. That was fine with her. In short, for the next few months, she didn't deliberately pay attention to Jason's situation. She just focused on living her life. Whenever she met friends, they often brought them up. At first, they defended her, saying Jason was deliberately flaunting their love to make her feel bad. Later, they said they started arguing over trivial matters, fighting incessantly. But she didn't care about any of that, because in her heart, things were a bit chaotic, and she still couldn't respond. Mark had to go abroad for business due to urgent matters with the branch office, and he would be gone for several months. However, she also suspected he was intentionally avoiding her. During this time, Ella was so upset that she couldn't focus on her studies. As soon as she got home from school, she would call Mark and tell him all the interesting things that happened in kindergarten. Mark always listened attentively and never brushed her off. 3 more months passed like this. When Mark returned to the country, he brought a whole box of toys, all of which Ella loved. Upon seeing her, he didn't exchange pleasantries and directly got to the point. Lisa, I gave you 3 months to think. Can you give me an answer now? She lowered her head and hesitated to respond, because she truly didn't know how to respond to Mark's feelings. After all, she had just come out of a failed marriage, and she didn't know whether what awaited her next would be clear skies or another abyss. She was scared, really scared, but she didn't hesitate for too long. She took Ella to the mall to buy clothes, and Ella took out her red envelope money, saying she wanted to pick a gift for Mark. She held on to Mark and wouldn't let go. In the end, the 3 of them had to go shopping together. By coincidence, she happened to see Jason in the mall, accompanied by Emily. The 2 of them were in a children's clothing store, with Jason holding a beautiful little dress in his hands. Judging by the size, it seemed to be for Ella. Emily looked upset. She snatched the dress from Jason's hands and slammed it onto the ground. Even from a few stores away, she could still clearly hear their conversation. Jason, get it straight. You and Lisa are divorced. The child belongs to her. And you don't need to buy clothes for Ella every time we go shopping. Emily was furious, her pretty face twisting in anger. The 2, once inseparable, were now fighting fiercely. Jason, contrary to my expectations of you being submissive and patient, you showed no signs of backing down. The deep affection I once saw in your eyes was fading away, replaced by irritation, and you began to retort, so what if we're divorced? Ella will always be my daughter. If it weren't for being with you, I would never have let Ella grow up without a father. I'm buying her some clothes to make up for it. Don't be so selfish. Selfish? Emily pointed at herself and suddenly laughed. Jason, who's really selfish here? I was ready to give up on you, but you rushed overseas and declared your love for me, saying I was the woman you loved most in your life. I was touched, even willing to take on the label of a mistress to be with you. Now that you finally divorced, you're just pining for Lisa and Ella, looking at their photos every night behind my back. What do you take me for? Her voice was so loud that not only she but also others in the mall couldn't help but look over, their eyes filled with curiosity. Jason had always cared about appearances. Seeing the gathering crowd, he forgot about buying the dress and immediately pulled Emily towards the exit. But Emily didn't care. She forcefully shook off his hand, demanding he make a choice. Jason, today I want you to clarify. Do you want to live well with me, or do you want to remarry your ex-wife and give your precious daughter a complete family? Clarify, clarify. How do you want me to clarify? I've said it 1,000 times. I'm divorced from Lisa, but Ella is my blood. I can't just ignore her. Why do you have to make it so difficult for me? You used to be so understanding, now you're being selfish, forcing that poor girl, Ella, to lose even the last bit of familial love. In the end, Emily slapped him hard in front of everyone. Jason's face turned ashen, and he turned to leave. As he spun around, their eyes met. Without a word, perhaps he felt embarrassed himself. But after a brief eye contact, he quickly turned and left, showing no hesitation. Mark took Ella and her to that children's store, where he picked out a dozen dresses, all of which she liked. I'll buy these for you from now on. We don't need 'em, Mark said, gently pinching Ella's cheek to ensure she didn't show any resistance before waving his hand and buying even more dresses. When they got home, she immediately saw Jason sitting in the hallway, having had some drinks. The imprint of the slap on his face was still quite clear. Ella was asleep in her arms, and she hadn't asked Mark to drive her back since he had to work the next day and needed to rest. She opened the door and placed Ella in her little bed. Jason stood at the door, reeking of alcohol, staring at her with an inexplicable sense of grievance. "Is something wrong?" she asked coldly, and his expression of grievance deepened. In the past, whenever she drank too much at a social gathering, he would always prepare ginger soup for her. "You've never spoken to me with such a cold tone before," he said, looking somewhat sad and aggrieved. But the truth was, she just took advantage of his kindness, didn't she? Perhaps her cold tone was too chilling, awakening him from the haze of alcohol. She tried to close the door, but he stopped it with his hand, a hint of confusion in his eyes. "Lisa, if I hadn't agreed to the divorce back then, would we still be the same family as before? There's no if in this world. If you were still you, there would never be a second outcome. Like a dog, one can never change its nature." Jason could never suppress that restless heart of his. What he couldn't have would always keep him in turmoil. So, in the last life, he could be with Emily for 50 years, and in this life, because of my resoluteness to divorce, he revealed his regret. But in either case, it only made me feel disgusted. His heart wasn't good. Wanting everything would only leave him with nothing. That night, Ella inexplicably developed a high fever, her body burning up. She even started convulsing. She hurriedly held her and wanted to drive to the hospital, but at the entrance of the community, she saw Mark sitting by the flower bed, lost in thought. He noticed her and the already unconscious Ella. She was so nervous that her hand shook, making it impossible to drive properly. "It's okay, Lisa. It's normal for children to have fevers. I'll take her to the hospital right now." "Don't panic or cry. Ella will be fine," Mark reassured her as he quickly drove towards the hospital. Fortunately, Ella's condition wasn't serious. It was just a viral infection that needed careful monitoring afterward. After hearing what the doctor said, she finally let out a long sigh of relief. All night long, Mark was busy taking care of everything. He put Ella to sleep and told her to rest in the nearby hospital bed. He stayed with the child all night, and they had agreed to take turns watching over her, but by the time she woke up, it was already bright outside. He had heavy dark circles under his eyes and yawned, covering his mouth. Seeing her awake, he lowered his voice and said, "Why don't you sleep a little longer? I'll go buy breakfast." "What do you want to eat?" Mark's voice was genuinely gentle. It was so gentle that, in a moment of impulse, she blurted out, "Mark, let's give it a try. If this still turns out to be a pitfall, then I could only say that I was destined to never deserve any happiness." After confirming their relationship, Mark was like a peacock displaying its feathers, immediately wanting to announce their relationship on social media. He even directly moved some of his things in. Fortunately, the apartment Ella chose was big enough, with plenty of spare rooms, so he could pick any room to stay in. On Mark's first day moving in, Ella was very excited and immediately took out her phone, saying she wanted to take a family photo. Just 5 minutes after posting the photo, a stranger's number called. But at that moment, she was in the bathroom showering, and her phone was in the living room, so Mark answered it. She could vaguely hear him speaking. "Looking for Lisa? She's taking a shower. She's too tired. Call back tomorrow." "Yes, she's tired. Ella is full of energy and had me playing all day." She felt like her bones were about to fall apart. After her shower, Mark handed her the phone with a sulky expression. He called. "Oh, Jason." There was no need to call back, so I tossed the phone onto the sofa and turned to her room to blow dry her hair. Half an hour later, the takeout she ordered arrived at the door. As she stepped out to grab the food, someone grabbed her wrist. "Lisa, are you with Mark?" Jason immediately questioned her. She shook off his hand forcefully. "What does it have to do with who I'm with?" But he frowned, looking completely puzzled. "We've only been divorced for less than half a year. How can you be with someone else? You clearly liked me so much back then, insisting that you would only marry me. We even have Ella. How can you just jump into a relationship with someone else? Did you really ever love me?" "Jason." She couldn't help but shout. "I've always known you were selfish, but I never imagined your ability to distort the truth could be so strong. You were the one who cheated first, and now you're trying to flip the script." "Yes, I'm with Mark. We're open and honest about it." But Jason persisted. "You were with me for 10 years and had a child. How could you not care? How could you truly be good to Ella?" Unable to hold back, she slapped him. "Don't think that just because you're dirty, the whole world is the same. Mark isn't like you. He truly loves me, which is why he's willing to love those I love. Mark once said, 'Lisa, Ella is your daughter. I love you, and I will love those you love.'" Jason fell silent for a moment, leaning against the wall, his shoulders slightly slumped. After a long while, he spoke softly, so quietly that she could hardly hear him. "If I regret it, would you give me another chance?" She replied, "Don't humiliate yourself." A month later, she heard the good news about Jason and Emily. After all, it had been more than half a year since their divorce, and Jason's family wanted a new daughter-in-law and a grandchild. The night before they got their marriage certificate, Jason sent her a long message. She didn't pay much attention to it, but the gist was that he missed the life they had together and their obedient and sensible daughter. If she was willing, he would remarry her and take care of Ella together. She didn't respond, feeling it unnecessary, but they got married and divorced within less than a month. Emily had always been a sensitive person, and even small matters could amplify her emotions infinitely, let alone the guilt-ridden Jason, who was always looking for opportunities to see Ella. The arguments between them were unavoidable. As loving as they once were, they now fought just as fiercely. But this had nothing to do with her. She was going to marry Mark. On the wedding day, however, Emily burst in wearing a white dress, disregarding everything as she rushed to the mirror and attempted to hit her. Mark immediately stepped in front of her, preventing her from succeeding. "Lisa, how can you be so shameless? You've clearly divorced Jason, yet you still cling to him day and night, making him think about that little bastard all the time. If it weren't for you, he and I wouldn't have ended up divorced." She had learned well from Jason how to flip the script. "You were the mistress during my marriage with Jason. After we divorced, there was almost no contact between us. If you two have a bad relationship, arguing every day only means your feelings for each other aren't strong enough. Emily, what right do you have to come here to make a scene? You can't stand to see me happy. Because you're pitiful and ugly. You want the whole world to be as unfortunate as you. But why should it be that way? You broke the moral code and should be punished for it. The more you make a scene now, the more everyone will think you deserve it. That it's your just desserts." And when Jason heard the news, he hurried over as well. He grabbed Emily, showing his impatience. "What are you making a scene about? If it weren't for your constant suspicion, we wouldn't be having these issues. Now you come to find Lisa. What right do you have to look for her? You were the one who chose to be the mistress and forget." His words were truly harsh. Jason had always been such a cold and heartless person. Fortunately, she managed to pull away in time in this lifetime. Otherwise, it would have been quite tragic. After saying this, Jason turned to look at her. At that moment, she had already changed into her wedding dress and was a beautiful bride. His eyes flickered, and she could tell he was lost in thought. He pressed his lips together, looking a bit sad. "Lisa, have you really made your decision?" She didn't answer, but the radiant smile of happiness on her face spoke for her. He continued, "If I took you away right now, would you be willing to leave with me?" Mark's face turned pale, and he clenched his fists tightly. If she hadn't stopped him, he would have punched Jason right in the face. She stepped closer and spoke in a voice meant only for them. "In my past life, you made me feel utterly disgusted. In this life, since we've both been reborn, let's not have any further connections. Jason, do you really not want to keep that last bit of dignity? He froze, shock written all over his face. She ignored him. The auspicious hour was approaching, and she had to go to the wedding venue. So she was unaware that after hearing her words, Mark, who had become listless, walked out of the hotel as if he had lost his soul. Emily, however, did not leave. Instead, she started venting her grievances, punching him repeatedly. The two of them wrestled and fought. On the roadside, it was unclear who lost their balance, but both of them tumbled down the stairs. A SUV sped by. However, she was oblivious to all this for the time being. Right now, she felt a bit nervous. The doors opened, and she looked at Mark standing at the end of the aisle. He was smiling at her. Their daughter was dressed as a little flower girl. Holding her hand, he guided her step by step toward Mark. She was walking toward true happiness, Ella's side story. If she said that she was reborn like in the TV dramas, would that be something shocking? That high fever made her remember many things. At 5 years old, she had memories of being 16. As for why she was 16, it was because she only lived that long in her past life. Looking back now, that wretched human trafficker sold her to a family that couldn't conceive. As a result, they became pregnant within a year and discarded her, claiming she wasn't their biological child. She didn't remember the specific details clearly. In any case, she was sold again. She was sold several times, whether it was through deliberately breaking her arms and legs to force her to beg on the streets or making her do things she didn't want to do. It was all quite distressing. She remembered where her home was, her parents' names, and the happiness and warmth she once had. She clearly remembered everything, but there was nothing she could do. Someone was watching her day and night, and she couldn't find a single chance to escape. But heaven also gave her an opportunity. Before she was sold for the last time, she saw her father on the street. At that time, her father looked exhausted, and she thought it was because of her disappearance that he had become so worn out. He passed right by her, and she screamed with all her might, but he didn't recognize her. Not only did he fail to recognize her, but he also kicked her, saying, "I didn't dirty my pants for you, you little beggar. This is a gift from Emily, you little thief. Don't touch me." Who is Emily? She didn't know. She only saw the missing person notice in her father's hand, and the photo and name on it weren't hers. He wasn't looking for her. She had her tongue cut out and couldn't speak, so she could only make incoherent sounds, which only earned her his disgust and the anger of the traffickers. This time, her luck was really bad. She was sold deep in the mountains to become an old man's wife. At 16, in what should have been a blooming age, yet she died from severe bleeding during childbirth. It was so painful. So when she realized she had been reborn, she felt truly joyful, but also quite sad. She knew her mother had never given up on her. She also knew her father's heart belonged to another woman. However, the appearance of Uncle Mark made her feel that happiness wasn't so far away after all. Her father wasn't a good father, but Uncle Mark could give her mother the happiness she desired and could also become her father. She suddenly felt quite lucky. At least in this lifetime, she would still have a complete and happy family, herself, her mother, her father, and Mark. They would all be very happy.